Good morning, everyone. My name is Will Tanner, and I'm the director of Onward, a think tank dedicated to renewing the centre-right for the next generation. And I'm delighted this morning to welcome you to the first event in our new panel series, Level Up. Before I begin, can I just very quickly ask all of our speakers to turn themselves on mute, and that should remove any feedback loops from the session. And obviously we will ensure that you unmute yourselves as we go forward. So what is Level Up, this series that we're about to embark upon? Well, over the next 3 months, we intend to explore what the government's commitment to levelling up means, why it matters, and how to go about achieving it. We will be looking in detail at questions as varied as how to build new clusters of innovation, how to revive manufacturing, how to bring good jobs to places that have lost them, and how things like transport, devolution, and digital infrastructure can help drive a more regionally balanced economy. We will be looking at the challenges, of course, and the things that industry might be looking for government to provide. But our intention is to move beyond just those challenges and also start to provide some of the solutions. And in doing so, to put meat on the bones of the government's central economic mission, to level up opportunity and growth right across the country so that everyone, no matter where they are, where they grow up, has an opportunity to go as far as their talents will take them. And I want to start today's session just by thanking the partners who have made this series possible. Companies like West Coast Partnership, Power to Change, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, the City of London, the Northern Health Services Alliance, BA Systems, and indeed the partner for today's event, City Fibre. Your support not only makes this series, these debates possible, but it also, I think, demonstrates the private sector firepower, some of that intellectual capital, which we can deploy in pursuit of this critical task. So, as I said earlier, our first event is on digital infrastructure, digital industry, how we can use digital to drive levelling up. The event is titled Full Fibre Growth, How Can Digital Industry and Infrastructure Drive Levelling Up? The pandemic has given us all a timely reminder of just how vital digital connectivity is to our lives. This event is in itself testament to the economic and social value of digital infrastructure. And the Prime Minister has made clear that far from blowing the government off course, the pandemic gives us a much greater chance to be radical, to do things differently, to build back better, to build back bolder. And so we will be doubling down on our strategy, he says. We will double down on levelling up. That is music to our ears at Onward. And I hope that today we can start to set out some of the answers of how to do that. In respect to digital, the government's already doing a lot. They've launched the 5G test beds. They've tried to make the UK one of the early adopters of 5G. They're forging a shared rural network agreement so that 95% of the UK gets 4G. They're committing billions to the UK gigabit programme. And they are, as I suspect the minister will set out, trying to break down barriers to planning and housing in order to drive out digital connectivity in full fibre. But we still have a long way to go, and we know that obstacles remain. So I hope today we can explore ways we can go further in our ambitions to use digital to level up. We want to look at how to streamline regulations over everything like from way leaves to the planning system in order to accelerate fibre. We want to look at the rural plans that the government has to see how we can drive competitive delivery there. And we will also look, I suspect, at how the government can respond to the shift to home working and how that might contribute to the wider plans for levelling up. To get into those questions, I'm delighted to introduce a fantastic panel, and I'm grateful to all of them for sparing the time for today's event. Our first panelist will be Chris Pincher, the Minister for Housing and Planning. Chris was appointed just before the pandemic, I believe, about a month before the pandemic hit. So much of his work has been during the emergency. He previously served as a minister in the Foreign Office and was also Deputy Chief Whip, and he's been MP for Tamworth since 2010. Second, we're going to hear from Henry Morrison, who is the director of the Northern Powerhouse Partnership, which was established by business and civic leaders across the North to drive the northern economy and to ensure a more regionally balanced conversation in our politics. It's chaired by George Osborne, the former Chancellor, and Henry previously served as a cabinet member for quality of life at Newcastle City Council, and has also worked for one of the Yorkshire Police and Crime Commissioners and for Yorkshire Building Society as well in a past life. Then we will hear from Simon Holden. Simon is Group Chief Operating Officer at City Fibre. He has 30 years experience working in telecoms, media and technology, was previously a partner at Goldman Sachs, where he held a variety of senior roles, including Global Chief Operating Officer and Vice Chairman of EMEA, as well as Global Head of Telecoms. And he has previously worked for Baring Brothers in both London and Hong Kong. And then finally, I'm going to turn to Esther McVeigh, who will be known to many of you as a former Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, a former Housing Minister, and also the founder of Blue Collar Conservatism, which has campaigned consistently on this issue since it was formed a number of years ago. Esther has been MP for Tatton since 2017 and previously was MP for Wirral West between 2010 and 2015, having been a successful television journalist before that. So in a moment, I'm going to shut up because you're not here to talk to listen to me. But before I do that, can I just say three quick bits of housekeeping? So firstly, all my speakers have turned themselves on mute. That's good. I will remind you if you get the mute button wrong over the course of the next hour and a quarter, but if you could try and stay on mute when you're not speaking, that would be helpful. Secondly, I will ask each of us panelists to give 5 to 7 minutes worth of remarks before I open to the floor for Q&A. Please feel free to ask questions as panelists are speaking. I will then pose them to the panelists after the opening remarks have closed. And just a reminder, we only have an hour and a quarter for this event. So please do ask questions early to ensure that they're asked, because we typically don't have time to get through all of them. And finally, if you have any technical issues whatsoever, please just email rsvp@ukonward.com and one of my team will get in touch. So without further ado, I'm delighted to open this event by handing over to Chris Pincher. Chris.
Well, thanks very much, Will, for that introduction. And thanks very much to Onward for inviting me to this Levelling Up first in series event. It's good to be back. It is great to see you and the Onward team, who I know take a particular interest in this topic and how we address the gap between opportunity, productivity and connectivity. Great also to see my colleague and predecessor, the great Esther McVeigh, leader of Blue Collar Conservatives, who are doing fantastic work along with Onward in this particular space. And thanks also, Will, for reminding me that I have been for the last year effectively the virtual Minister of Housing. We've all been rather virtual this last 12 months, haven't we? I think it's right you're putting digital and digital connectivity at the heart of your Levelling Up series. The coronavirus pandemic, as I think you have rightly pointed out, has changed society significantly, but the changes were, I think, evident before that. The Amazon effect was already clear on our high street, but the pandemic has brought the challenges and changes to our society and the way we live and work into sharp focus. I've got some statistics in front of me which show that UK broadband usage doubled in 2020 compared to 2019, and adults in the United Kingdom are now spending a quarter of their day online, as those of us that have had to log on to and make the trip down to Specsavers in the last few months can attest. It's changing quite literally the way we work. But we need to look beyond the world of the pandemic to the world that will be beyond it. And that's what my colleagues in DCMS are doing with respect to broadband infrastructure. They're investing £5 billion in the UK gigabit programme. More than half the country is expected to be connected to gigabit capable networks by the end of this year, and that rises to, I think, by 85% by 2025. So we've got a programme that we are determined to pursue. But I wanted to talk in the 5 minutes or so that I have, more particularly, as you rightly, I think, averred, to the planning system and the way we need to change it and make it take advantage of digital technology so that everybody can take better advantage of the planning system. We've already made some strides in that direction because of the pandemic. You may know that as a result of the changes we made to the Business Recovery Bill, now an act last year, planning committee meetings in councils can be virtual. The Planning Inspectorate acts virtually. They've undertaken 600 inquiries and adjudications virtually. Something like 23,500 people have got involved in the Holocaust memorial stream. 16,500, I think, was the number that got involved in the South Oxfordshire District Plan adjudication. So it shows you what technology can achieve. But those are only the first steps. What we really need to do is to reform the planning system, which is now 73 years old. And those of you that are as old as me, not quite 73, will probably remember the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And you'll remember the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy planning application for the destruction of the Earth. That particular planning application could not be objected to because it was legally and visibly filed at the bottom of a locked filing cabinet, which was housed in a disused lavatory, which had a sign on the door saying, "Beware of the leopard." Now, I'm not saying that the planning system that we know today is quite that exaggerated. I think that particular application might fail on appeal. But the point is that it is a very opaque system. Remember, that was 40 years ago when Douglas Adams wrote that. We've had several reforms which have made it even more opaque and Byzantine since then. So what we need to do is to make sure that the legacy software systems which burden the sector with repetitive tasks are removed. The user experience, which presently discourages involvement in planning. Essentially, most of us have nothing to do with it beyond a rain-soaked, wind-swept notice at the end of the road nailed to a lamppost. We need to move on from that into a world of interactive digital tools, because if we don't, the present situation will obtain, which is that something like 7% of local people say that they don't trust their local councils, or only 7% of local people say that they trust their councils to make a proper decision about planning. Only 3% of local people get involved in any individual planning application, and only 1% of local people get involved when it comes to local plan making. I mean, you can make an argument to say that that is essentially planning professionals and blood relatives getting involved and nobody else. We need to change that, and that's what we are trying to do. We need to, therefore, work closely with the prop tech sector to see what sorts of digital tools there are available to roll out so that people can get their arms around, as well as their eyes, get their arms around 3D views of local plans, what local modelling means for their communities, where they can see the buildings which are proposed, the design of those buildings, where they can see what sorts of infrastructure support is provided, where light and shade and shadow can also be shown on these models, so that people really have a view as to what is going to be designed for their neighbourhood. So that digital planning groups, neighbourhood groups, running alongside physical town hall meetings can get more people involved, so that you actually have community engagement in the design, the strategic design of local plans, which are no longer tactical and piecemeal, but which allow people a real say in the design of their entire geography, and which will break down the adversarial system that we have built up over several years. It also means, therefore, that the planning system, through digitalization, can be much more speedy as well as transparent. Presently, it takes something like 7 years to adopt a local plan. We want to reduce that to 2. Planning applications can take up to 5 years before a single brick is laid. We want to cut that down as well, using digital technology to allow zones to be properly defined by local authorities with the input of local people, where fast-track building can take place, again, agreed by the local community. And that means more SMEs can get involved. It means there's more certainty in the system, and it means our objective of building those 300,000 good quality, well-designed homes up and down the country every year by 2025 can be more effectively achieved. So we've got the homes that people want because we've got a planning system that allows them to become involved. That can only be done through digitalization. It can only also ensure that the planning professionals are able to do the jobs that they really want to do, that they train to do when they're at university, which is to develop strategic plans, not be tactical box tickers in the present system. So I really believe that the digital agenda can help level up our planning system and can make it more effective for the modern era. If we do that, then we can build those homes, we can achieve the objectives that we want. We can also avoid phone calls taking place in my office when I'm just coming to my peroration and slightly distracting me. But it also means that we can now move on to the next speaker, who I think is Henry, who I'm sure has got his mobile phone and his desk phone switched off. He's going to give us a great presentation, and then we're going to come to some questions.
Chris, thank you so much, and fantastic to see you using the power of digital to transform the planning system, and I hope we can come on to both some questions about that, but then also talk more about how we can plan for digital as well as how we can use digital in planning, if that makes sense. So Henry, can I now pass to you for your comments? I'd love to hear what the MPP's view of all of this is, and what you're looking for in terms of policy and political direction. Henry.
Thanks, Will. And I mean, it's great to be with Onward today, and obviously we now have a number of us working on these themes, which obviously wasn't the case a number of years ago. And the space that's opened up to talk about the role of places in these economic kind of transformations we want in our society is a really important one, because I think that there are many people in public policy who would agree of the power of digitalisation of public services in the economy, as we've just heard from the Planning Minister and Housing Minister. All of these are important transformations happening in our economy, but understanding how that relates to regional economies and how those are opportunities for us to capture, that's a new debate that didn't used to exist, right? In the same way that in Chris's department, you can talk about how modern methods of construction, for instance, might and housing might be particularly beneficial to certain parts of the country. Fibre to the premises and access to the internet and to digital is an important part of the economic toolkit and the social toolkit available to us. So a couple of things I wanted to talk about very briefly, some of which very much cross over what Simon and Esther will talk about, and both of them are experts in many of those things. So I won't dwell on either for too long. I'm sure they'll come up again in the discussion. In terms of the pandemic, I want to talk a little bit about access and about levelling up and regional inequalities in the context of those who might be excluded from the labour market and from opportunities. So clearly, the thing that is a challenge for parts of the country that have had economic challenges, it's not that there isn't economic success in parts of the north of England, it's that we have more parts of the north, pockets and larger areas, pockets in constituencies like Esther's, which was previously represented by my chair, George Osborne, but also big city regions, right? And they exist in all of those places. And during the pandemic, you saw school kids unable to work. That was highly concentrated in more disadvantaged communities, including some in Esther's patch, where she worked with us to try and deal with and address some of those issues in some of her schools. And the DWP, actually, to give them credit, there's lots of things that have gone on during the pandemic that no one's heard about. So the DWP were out giving out vouchers to people who'd been made unemployed through the pandemic in Cheshire and Greater Manchester. That's a scheme they're now intending to make national, with the idea that the kind of job club of the kind of evocative kind of northern cultural institution of a certain film about unemployed steel workers in Sheffield, the Full Monty, obviously a cultural reference, I'm sure, Will, that you will have no problem with me raising in this session. That job club doesn't exist anymore, right? It certainly didn't exist during the pandemic, and it isn't the best way to help people find work. And so the idea of the person having to walk around handing out CVs, actually able to then get a job within 2 weeks because they've been given access to the internet, that is a real enabler. And I think we need to be really focused on the fact that access to digital is not, and now we've also funded all these kids to have laptops. There's an existential question about how we keep those being used and those children being able to learn. And so that all this work we've done during the pandemic around what is a kind of an acceptable level of inclusion we have in our society around this stuff absolutely has to be high up the agenda for what we do next, particularly if we talk about what are the ways that we can address what it's like living in disconnected places. So clearly, this is an issue that affects many rural communities as much as big cities, and we need to really focus on what that looks like in terms of what those policy solutions are. It's not necessarily just about the public sector funding that. If you look at what's happened in the States, clearly some of the streaming services play a big role in funding infrastructure. You've also got to think about, if you're going to, as the state, get more involved in this space, I think that many businesses like TalkTalk in that case were doing something basically without making any money out of it. They were doing it as a social obligation. And finding ways to work with businesses who are socially motivated in this space, I think, is really powerful for government. And I think it's not about endless subsidies or huge amounts of public money, but about saying, actually, what is the role of the public sector? What's the role of private businesses? And it's certainly something we're going to do more work on in the coming weeks. And we look forward to talking about that a bit more. But I think it's being here with you today, Will, a good chance to open up some of those discussions and debates, because we think it's not just an issue in the North, but it's a wider one. You then get onto availability. And clearly, we've already had in the chat questions about rural connectivity. I'm sure we'll get lots of that during the discussion. We have those issues in the North. But I think that what we have to focus on, and I'm sure Simon will talk about it a lot more and much more eruditely than I will, the economic role of fibre to the premises, both for businesses and individuals. I think it's a transformational point about how we get the best of kind of the pandemic world, right? So people still want to go work in cities, in towns. Many jobs still require people to be in work, right, physically, and have required that throughout the pandemic. But I think giving people the option where they can to work more remotely is going to be a lot easier with really high quality access to a genuinely fibre product. And those cities like York that were sort of top of the list in terms of rollout have found lots of use cases, both in terms of public services, health and social care in particular, but I'm sure others will come forward, where this can be transformational. And it also gives us the opportunity to be able to compete globally. So I don't think that any longer having poor quality digital infrastructure will be sustainable if you're trying to attract significant investment. I think it's a significant barrier, and it's a hygiene factor that I'm really glad to see the government is helping to address. And it's worth saying what a role that Metro mayors have played in that. So in Greater Manchester, for instance, the Metro Mayor and the government have worked hand in hand to accelerate the rollout of fibre. In Greater Manchester, it was local authorities like in York that took a particularly visionary approach to working with City Fibre and some of their partners previously. That's exactly the way that this can work. And I think it's a challenge to government around seeing sort of big national programmes. I think DCMS is actually one of those departments, a bit like MHCLG, that has a more bottom-up approach to public policy making. We need to see that intensified over in coming months, because what I would challenge government around is that we are going to see many of our left behind towns connected up to fibre in the coming years. And I think how we then get businesses to adopt and take advantage of those products when they're available, I think is a really big opportunity for us. Once it's there, it's a huge asset for the economy that we need to get people using. And I think the way we would explain it to people in terms of the North and how the North works is that many parts of the north of England have traditionally been very disconnected. West Yorkshire, where I'm sitting, Esther's constituency in the northwest, not easy places to travel between, which is ridiculous when you consider the social economic ties between those places. You invest in something like Northern Powerhouse Rail, you build a new train station in Bradford, you improve all this transport connectivity. Well, people aren't necessarily going to have to travel from Cheshire or from Liverpool to Bradford or to Newcastle to Liverpool across to Hull every day, right? They are going to be a lot more flexible in how they work. And an economy like that will rely on its digital infrastructure as much as its transport. And just because digital infrastructure is largely funded by investment banks and not by the government doesn't make it less important economically to the north of England. So we haven't got a big ask, Will, for lots more public money in this space. It's more about what role the government can play as an enabler, trusting mayors to play a bigger role in this space, because actually this is a great example of where private capital is going to unlock significant productivity enhancement. And we need to make sure we then may really capitalise on it. And that's why I'm so glad to see you guys work in this space and others of us who are interested in regional productivity, because I think it's a huge area for all of us to be able to exploit and not just rely on central government investment as the driver, because actually it is people like Simon and his investors who actually are going to fund the great part of this, right? And the government's investment, welcome as it is still a fraction of what's actually going into this space. And that's to be welcomed, because it should be the role of private capital where it can to lead the way in these issues.
Henry, thank you so much. That was a brilliant kind of overview of some of the core kind of economic potential of this technology, but also some of the kind of issues that can emerge when there are gaps, both regionally and for certain people within society or for certain families. And we've now had cultural references to both Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and the Full Monty, so I'm expecting a lot from both Simon and Esther in their final remarks. Simon, I'm now going to come to you. I'd love to hear more about City Fibre's plans and your perspective on what more needs to be done, and anything that you're particularly keen to see coming out of government over the next few years in order to help drive levelling up through digital. Simon.
Great, thank you very much, Will. Well, you won't be surprised to hear that we are absolutely behind the ambition to roll out full fibre by 2025. And I think for us, we see in a post-Brexit Britain, with a predominantly service-based economy, that having the best digital infrastructure in the world rolled out ubiquitously across the country would be a really important facilitator for, just overall economic growth. So naturally, we're behind that and behind that ambition. And I think, you heard from the minister, a fantastic use case in respect to planning. But I could tell you that, looking at your 3D planning models, it might take you a little while to download that today, download that software, have that interactive on the infrastructure that we sit at the moment. And so that's why building this digital infrastructure is so important. And we're incredibly lucky in this country because the amount of investment that is going into software and engineering is huge. Highest in Europe. We have some of the most talented people in the world sitting in the UK and the ecosystem to take advantage of it. But it's time to now get that infrastructure really motoring. So, our program is £4 billion investment, covering 8 million homes, 800,000 businesses, 400,000 public sector sites, and 250,000 5G access points. It's a network that, everyone talks about 5G. 5G runs on fibre. This is the base load that is going to carry the connectivity. And we have made a decision not to build in the biggest metropolitan centres. We think the biggest opportunity for this network is actually outside those. But of course, we're naturally, orientated towards big towns. So we're doing Leeds, Middlesbrough, Sheffield, Wigan, Harrogate, and Bolton. But actually on Friday last week, we announced an extension to our network. So we've completed now and declared all our towns and villages. We added 218 cities, towns, and villages last Friday to our list. So we're moving out of those big centres and moving into slightly smaller towns, maybe commuter towns to some of those bigger metropolitan areas. So places like Redcar, Stockton-on-Tees, Rochdale, and Redcar, which is a particular favourite because that's where my mum was brought up. So, and this has actually been set up because the government has promoted competition. Okay, and Ofcom has rolled in behind and set up a regulatory framework that has now allowed investment to take place. And this week we're going to see the kind of latest iteration of consultations coming out of Ofcom that are going to set the playing field for the next 5 years. A lot of commentary in the weekend papers about that in respect of BT, but it's clearly going to be pro-competitive, right? And that is good because if it wasn't, we wouldn't be around. The reason that BT is now investing in fibre, and indeed Virgin is talking about investing in fibre, is because there is now the opportunity for challengers to come in and build. So we're very supportive of that. And so I think, the playing field is well set. So if there were 3 things I would highlight that the government can really help us do, and policymakers generally, And I would say that in the context of where both central and local government has been incredibly supportive. I would focus on these three things. Number one, rural. Okay, I think that we are trying to build a ubiquitous network, but it is just very, very expensive to do the very last piece of that. But that last piece is only about probably 2% of the country, because the way that Britain is set up is we have, the highest density of population of any big country in Europe. We have the highest level of urbanization. And actually, even when people talk about rural, in fact, there are clusters of 500 homes, and it's just you've got to connect down the road to the village, and it's actually very efficient to build the village. So we see the reason we've announced 218 locations is because we are now building outside our original city boundaries, and we're getting towards that rural. But we know the last bit of that, which everybody wants us to connect. Of course, the customers want it, the local authority wants it, all of the MPs want it, but it's just expensive to do. But I think the one thing, and I would take my kind of hat off despite a lot of pressure, is I think DCMS and BD UK are being really thoughtful about how to do that and making sure that that's being done in a competitive way, which is going to drive really good value for money for the taxpayers and frankly probably make it go faster. But there's $1.25 billion to deploy in the next 18 months or so. We think that's key because for us that locks in the end of our value chain. That means that we can build the old BT exchange areas. We can go and build those. We can cover everyone in a constituency. That makes a lot of sense to us to do that. So I'd say that's high on the government's list, but obviously in progress right now. Second area would be wayleaves. We're not a utility business. So we constantly have challenges to connect people that want the product because we have to go through a kind of private landlord wayleave, and that process is ponderous and cumbersome. There's an opportunity to improve that now through the Electronic Communications Code, which is currently going through Parliament, and we'd really encourage ambitious thinking. I think one of the things that we would encourage is actually thinking about a 5-year fibre wayleave, where if you're connecting fibre, actually let's just allow that to happen and to move forward as though it was electricity or gas or water, and we could go and do that. That would be a game changer. We could roll out a lot quicker, and we could access some of those more remote customers that want this service much faster. So we'd encourage that sort of broad and probably quite radical thinking in terms of property law. But this will take 5 years to build this network, and then after that you could go back to kind of as you were. But that would be a huge opportunity to move faster. And then the last thing I would say is really adoption. A lot of people in the country today believe that they have a fibre product, which is actually sitting on copper. The government, by the way, is about to commit to spend £5 billion for a product which is fibre, when a lot of customers say, well, I've already got fibre. And we know this because we're going down the streets of Britain, we're tearing up people's streets and they're saying, what are you doing? We're saying we're laying fibre. And they say, well, I've already got fibre. So there's an education process that has to be gone. And we're talking about a step change here. We're talking about 10 to 100 times the speed for half the price. Okay, so this is a total step change in what people can do with this technology. And I think it's reasonably fair that people understand what it is that they're going to be therefore getting in the bang for their buck. So there's some work we're doing with a group called GigaTag that's been commissioned by the government, but that adoption piece for households, small businesses, really, really important. And I think those three components as we see today would make a tremendous difference to, one, our speed of rollout, but two, the speed of adoption for the end customer. And that is what's going to change the game for the UK. So we're very positive about it. We have a great opportunity ahead of us.
Simon, thank you so much. That was both just amazingly interesting, but also very practical, getting into some of the specific things that the government could do and could do relatively quickly as well to speed up change. So that's precisely what we want to do with this series. So thank you very much. I'm now going to hand to Esther, last but not least. And Esther, the Minister referred to the fact that he's he's kind of speeding up the planning system. You'll know all about that as from your previous experience, but you've got new experience from the blue collar Conservatives thinking about some of the politics of this precisely, and so not just some of those policy questions, but also the politics. So I'd love to hear from you on some of those questions, if that was right. Esther McVeigh.
Oh, thanks, Will. Well, actually, the panel are bringing different parts of the jigsaw together here. And as Chris rightly said, you know, the levelling up agenda is the Conservative agenda. And Boris has said he wants to double down on that levelling up. And that is key. And I believe that full fibre, that 1 gigabit capability is the most important infrastructure that we can give to the country at the moment. That is the most significant infrastructure project we have, and I think it would be truly transformational for the whole of the country. Now, I don't know if Simon gave his cultural reference, but my cultural reference, having followed Chris and Henry, I'm going to talk about pubs and podcasts, if that's allowed, because you talked about the blue collar Conservative group. So I've been, or was, going around the country, whether it was Oldham or whether it was Hastings, whether it was Southend-on-Sea or whether it was Workington, going to pubs there. It wasn't like the biggest pub crawl ever. I was going around speaking to people on the ground, seeing what they needed, why they felt excluded and why they felt they needed to be levelled up and in what way they needed to be levelled up. And those pub tours stopped last about February, really, rather than last March the 23rd. And then I went on to podcast, and it was a way to have blue collar conversations, carry on what we're doing and doing it in a different way. And I guess if this tells you the difference between that physical reach going into pubs, I saw 50 people, maybe, if they came down and saw us, and via podcasts, we're reaching 1,000 people a podcast. Now, I'm sure this podcast doing much better than that, but for me, it's sort of extended and expanded significantly that reach. And that's why I think we've got to make sure that we not only listen to people on the ground, what is it they need, but also explain quite clearly what this digital infrastructure could mean for them. Chris rightly said that internet demand was here pre-pandemic. It was growing 40% a year pre-pandemic, with the National Ordnance Office saying that demand would outstrip supply in that part copper, part cable, part copper, part fibre areas by 2030, 2040. So we already knew there was an issue there. And then in the last year, BT reported that the increase of traffic and of demand on our infrastructure has been 35 to 60% as we're all locked at home. And as various other people, Henry has said, you know, it isn't just nice to have now digital infrastructure. It is absolutely essential to have. If you know 700,000 visits to the GP are now being done on the internet rather than going to see the GP, if you know there's 2 million people claiming their benefit online, if you know there is homeschooling, if you know there is home working, this is now a crucial part of the infrastructure for our country. And equally, we know we lag behind the EU, and we also know we lag behind the rest of the world. So we're looking at those divides, and those divides that were already opening up, but we know that it's actually been turbocharged over the last year. We know 1 million households have no internet connection, and that's 5.3 million people who don't have access to the internet. And where have those divides fallen? Yes, they have fallen and divided up those on lower income, on those on higher income, to have that sort of digital inclusion, and significant difference between cities, towns, and rural areas. So for me, in Cheshire, there are now 22,000 premises in Cheshire alone with speeds below 30 megabits. So that's way, way below the 1 gigabit. That's below 30 megabits. And in my area in Tatton, some of those are at 2 megabits. And these are people trying to run businesses, trying to teach people at home. And therefore, it is essential that we significantly do the infrastructure. And this, as both Henry said and Simon said, you know, there is a part sort of government support, and the rest has to be commercially viable. So some of the areas in my patch, as Simon was talking about before, are the hardest to reach. So when BT and Openreach come and visit some of my homes, they will say, we'd love to be able to help you, but it's not commercially viable, and they won't be connected up for some time to come, or won't get a faster broadband speed for some time to come. And so if we talk about what we'd like to do, or what I'd like to do, I think Simon touched on some of those things where we're talking about the ability to go into premises, the ability to go over land. So that way leaves issue is a really big and significant issue. I also think identifying what would be the role for local government, what is the role for devolved governments, and what is the role for central government. You know, 1.7 million postcodes, how are we dividing them up geographically? How are we dealing with those different postcodes? And we have got legislation pretty much done. Chris will know that. We're just waiting for the royal assent there, which is, and I fully support it, putting it or recognising the need for digital infrastructure to be as important as water and electricity. However, we've got to make sure that that commercial side of the equation doesn't knock out those premises getting that digital infrastructure. So I have in my patch across farms where they can now request, it is essential, they do need it, it's still getting turned down on the commercial part, saying we don't have the money, it isn't sufficient, we cannot connect you, even though they've managed to appeal it on the fact that it should be done and it's the right thing to do. So I think if I was looking at key things we need to do, it is the way leaves. It is making sure that people do have the same right to broadband as they do water and electricity. I think we need to see how can we do the process of connection better. Are we using modern forms of technology to embed those cables? What can we do better? Do we need to dig up a whole road, or if we use modern methods, we could actually lay those cables from one point? I see Simon's nodding his head here, so he knows exactly what I'm talking about. And then when we look at jobs, apprenticeships and education, we could roll this all out together. You know, they say there's possibly 10,000 jobs here in the laying of and delivering of internet to the whole of the country. Well, we're going to need those 10,000 jobs coming out of this COVID pandemic. They say that would lead to 1.25 million skilled jobs by 2025, and they say that could deliver 59 billion to the economy. So it is vital we do this. And I do believe the government could be putting in more money to this project. And it was 5 billion that the government was putting in, but it's actually gone down for the immediacy down to 2 billion. So there is a shortfall there. And instead of being 100% rollout by 2025, it will be 80% rollout by 2025. So I do believe there is things we can do. And I will do a comparison between HS2 and digital infrastructure. HS2 provides some stops for some people wanting to use the railway network, and it's costing 100 billion upwards that the government is putting in. It won't be delivered up north until 2040. What we need for this digital infrastructure is far less. As I said, we've already reduced the pot from 5 billion down to 2 billion at this moment in time. I would say stop that HS2, which only connects some people up, put it into digital infrastructure, which would be connecting everybody up. And that would not only be greater value for money, it could be delivered in a shorter time frame, 2025 rather than 2040. And it would be an enabler, not just for a journey, but for absolutely everybody needs. Like I said, hospital appointments, socializing now, should we need to have social distancing, or should anywhere go into a lockdown, doctor's appointments, jobs, and getting benefits. So there's a whole host of things there that we need to support And again, I think Simon talked about this post-Brexit future. What is our Brexit dividend? How are we going to become global traders? How are we going to enable the next younger generation who are tech savvy to use those skills, set up online, and then be able to connect not only with the country, but the rest of the world? It needs to be through digital infrastructure. So yes, this government has got huge ambitions. Yes, it's delivered a lot, but the pandemic has absolutely said or shown that we need to turbocharge what we're doing. And the Conservatives are all about value for money and prioritization. And this is now the #1 infrastructure project that needs to be prioritized.
Esther, thank you so much. And it's fantastic to be able to hear your view of some of the politics, but also some of the kind of practical steps that we could take. And it really does feel like there are a number of areas of agreement already emerging before we go into Q&A. So there was clearly a very strong belief that this is kind of the most important infrastructure for future economic growth, a kind of Model T Ford of this generation, the thing that can really unlock economic opportunity and growth for individual families. A few comments suggesting that devolution and local government has a really big role to play. I'd be interested in the minister's views on that, given the department in which he sits, and then also some questions about the kind of regulatory framework that sits around kind of digital infrastructure, the permissions that are needed in order to put infrastructure in, the relationship with kind of freeholder and leaseholder rights, and the kind of how do we ensure that the people who want full fibre broadband can get it in a way that is cheap, easy, and speedy. So a number of different ideas coming to the fore. I'm going to kick off the Q&A by abusing the chair's position, and just picking up something Simon said, which is this idea of a temporary kind of way-leave dispensation to effectively say that for a limited period of time, full fibre providers can or should be able to go into any premise, a set of premises, and install full fibre to anyone that wants it in exactly the same way as they would be able to do for electricity or gas or water. I'm interested instinctively in people's reactions to that. I might come first to the minister if he's willing to. It might not be something that he's able to comment on directly, but I'm interested in his views instinctively on whether or not there is a case for a slightly more interventionist approach from government on things like way leaves. Minister.
Thanks, Will. Well, we have taken a more interventionist approach, if you will, with, for example, our consultation which has just concluded on permitted development rights for the better implementation of broadband connectivity, making it easier for companies to go about their business and effectively install pylons or boxes or whatever is required. I mean, I'm very happy to, with other colleagues across government departments, look at the way leave option. I just cancel, though, that there are some significant downsides to the upsides, insofar as there's the hassle factor that people on the receiving end need to consider. There is also the fact that up and down the country in business properties and in private properties, there are all sorts of different leasehold or freehold or other rights that would need to be considered both on land and in property. So this is not a straightforward proposition, would need to be considered very carefully. But as to the thrust of it, can we do more to move quickly? Then I think that we probably can.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister. And I totally appreciate this is not necessarily an issue. But it does feel to me, at least, that when we're talking about project speed in government and the need to massively accelerate everything from the planning system through to infrastructure delivery, that there must be more that we can do to speed up the delivery of fibre to the premises. Simon, you've obviously put forward this proposal, so I'm just going to quickly come to Henry and Esther just on it very specifically, and then this idea specifically of a kind of temporary dispensation, because I think that kind of has some merit, and then I'm going to open up to some of the Q&A from the audience too. So Henry first, and then Esther, if that's right.
I'm with you. Well, I think it's partly as well about understanding the importance of this infrastructure and its equivalent, say, to the electricity distribution and gas distribution companies who have been around forever, right? And needing to give the same ability and freedom, right, to reduce costs, which in the end increases the speed of the rollout, right? Every bit of paperwork, and certainly in Greater Manchester, there, as well as investing in infrastructure, they've been very clear about putting in place better and more consistent approaches across local government. And I do think this is another example, I would argue, of where you are seeing places who want this investment being prepared to compromise, being easier, certainly not seeing this as a financial opportunity to make money for their areas, bluntly, from where they may have assets. And the same is true of 5G rollout, where obviously public institutions and physical assets and communities are really valuable, right, to 5G. Well, they're assets for public good, and how local places get revenue from their lampposts and stuff is clearly important, but what is most important is they enable that connectivity as quickly and easily as possible to be available to people. And that's a really important point about where the public realm has to be in space, which is it's an enabler, right, for private investment, and that's its primary role. And I think whether it's through the planning system or through how assets are used by places, there needs to be a real appreciation of the role the public sector has in making this easier.
Thank you, Henry. Esther, could I come to you? And Minister, I'm sorry to do this, but could I ask you to go on mute just briefly, just because I heard a little bit of feedback. Esther.
Yes, I'll explain where I'm getting some of the problems from at the moment, and whether that is in flats and trying to connect people there, whether it is across other people's land as it goes maybe down sort of roads across fields, but then that's whole loads of premises that aren't connected. And that's not just a house, that is also business premises. So by not being connected, you're not just looking at an individual or a household's ability not to be connected, is also looking at the economic performance of entire areas. So I've got places in Cheshire that move their businesses out to a rural setting because it gave them more land to be able to do the jobs they needed to do. But now they're finding they've got the land, they've got the space, but they haven't got the connection. So whether that's sort of real-time information, whether that's downloading the books now, or whether it's just getting information in and out of their business. So we have to view it as economic development, increased growth, and not just growth. It will be stopping the moving out of areas that did have those businesses, were prosperous, but are now moving out of these areas somewhere else, but maybe somewhere without the space that they need to perform the manufacturing that they fundamentally do. So what I would say is, look, this internet connection now is a utility, and we have to view it as a utility, not part utility and maybe, and what can we do? Chris is absolutely right that this is not, it's not going to wave a wand here, and it's not going to go away overnight, but maybe we do try and drive it through over a certain period of time. We look to that 2025 deadline, and let's see what we can put in place in temporary measures. And what I will say, HS2 at the moment has got some intrusive measures how it can go onto people's land, what it can do, how it can dig out, what piles it can do, what sort of industrial moving of soil and land journeys per day can do into very remote areas without the roads to be able to do that. So let's not think we haven't managed to use powers to get things built and done and across lands. We're doing it with HS2. We just need to say, how do we do it for here? And what I would predict, look, we have energy performance certificates for houses. We need internet performance certificates for houses. People will want to move somewhere to live if they have got internet connection. Businesses will only want to move somewhere if they've got internet connections. And what you're going to do, if you don't look after some of the nicest areas in the country, or have been deemed to be, or have just got the space for manufacturing companies to go there, you're having a massive geological shift. You're going to have a massive churn in the country. And as people are looking for a greener environment, they're looking for a healthier environment, they're looking not to all live on top of one another. They're moving out to the more rural areas, the towns and the countryside. So we need to catch up with that and allow people to do that with the infrastructure, which is your 21st century infrastructure.
Thank you so much, Esther. So I think so that's really interesting, and it does feel like there's an interesting opportunity there. And as you say, Esther, we should be kind of thinking about the parallels with other forms of infrastructure and the powers that exist there. I'm going to now turn to a question from Warren White, who has asked, what can we do to expedite rural fast broadband? He argues that the voucher scheme and reliance on voluntary community leadership is quite slow, quite cumbersome. We don't expect this for electricity or water supply, so why broadband again? Invoking the kind of utility argument, and saying that there are still villages in his ward without 3G mobile phone signal or decent broadband speeds. Simon, you spoke a little bit about this. You said rural was the first thing on your 3-point list that the government should focus on, and it sounds like your model does allow you to get there, but eventually and potentially with a bit of help at the end. I'd be interested in what you think the government could do today to speed up rural delivery of fibre.
So I think it's faster than eventually will.
Right.
Actually, what is happening right now is there's a process that's being run by BD UK to basically parcel up buckets of subsidy to get to those most remote rural areas. And I think the work that's been done is excellent. We're just about to move into a kind of pilot scheme to start rolling those out. And that's going to roll in anger over the next kind of 18 months for the first billion, 1.2 billion or so of subsidy. So I think there's already a lot of work being done, around that, and it's very welcome. And I think there are two elements of that that are really positive. The first element is that they have done a lot of, I would argue, really surgical analysis of where that subsidy is required by classifying different exchange areas. And by doing that, they've then identified, who are the people that can compete to build. So I think that's been a really smart, it's taken a bit of time to do it because it's really a lot of computational analysis, the geospatial analysis that you need to do that. But what they've now got is actual competition. And that competition will be the thing that ensures you get the best coverage at the very best price. That you're not just handing the money over to the incumbent player in the market, but actually you've got multiple players who will go and do this, and with a coverage expectation that comes along that. So when people are concerned about the speed of this and concerned about will the most remote places get connected, then I think the answer to that is you can engineer it. But as important, you can engineer it with a subsidy that actually is value for money because you've got competition to deliver it. So I think, and it's evolving and there'll be more work on this, but from what I can see today, actually, I think really good progress is being made on that. So I think we're positive and we want to participate in that because we think it leverages our infrastructure and helps us to get, by the way, kind of market return on that investment going forward.
Thank you very much, Simon. That's very encouraging, and having followed the BD UK process a little bit over the last few months and year or so, it's kind of very good to hear that is going well. I'm going to now I might come to Henry on this point as well, because I'm interested. You talked a little bit about availability and rural availability. Beyond the BD UK process, are there things that you think government should be doing to level up rural connectivity, Henry?
So I think it's really interesting, isn't it? Because what you want is to deal with the greatest number of people with the lowest possible amount of resource. And I think the kind of the learning from the previous program is you can spend a lot of time thinking about relatively small numbers of people. Does that make sense? And actually, sometimes these issues include quite large numbers. Does that make sense? And that's the bit I would say from an economic standpoint is that where I think and there hasn't historically been competition, but the same way that City Fibre are competing in what you would call kind of commercial areas of the country, there are many other outfits now out and about doing stuff in this space who are not just Openreach, right? And I think that is a positive sign that markets are working. So again, I think my point would be that actually for many people, for those groups, at least the previous rollout of fibre to cabinet has had some benefits. Does that make sense? So rural broadband is in a better place than it otherwise would have been. But anyway, what you often found was that from a lot earlier stage, it was realised that fibre to the premise was probably a better solution for most rural communities than still relying on any copper at all. And so in some ways, the fibre rollout in some rural areas has been faster than some urban areas. So I also would celebrate the successes, right, which is what Esther, I think, is rightly referring to. The challenge of is the kind of the limitations of a rollout that probably wasn't bold enough on fibre to the premises when we had the last load of investment in rural communities. I think we aren't making that mistake this time. And I think certainly from the rural areas that we've worked on where we've got concerns, I think there is a real change. And I think the market and the dynamics that we've discussed, I think are going to solve those challenges in rural communities. But what we've got to be really clear about is that the investment to get to everyone means that you've got to have the right momentum to get to large numbers of properties. And so the kind of what we can't do is simply pay whatever it costs, right, to Openreach to deliver a particular technical solution. And we're luckily not in that hostage territory this time, and we were there a few years ago. So some of that learning, we have to reflect on that. The public money wasn't always well spent previously. We need to not get into the mistake of allowing that to happen again, because whether a place is commercial or not commercial, we should still be getting best value, whether it's for a private investor or for the taxpayer. And I feel that we're a lot closer to that this time than we have perhaps in the past.
Thank you, Henry. That's a beautiful segue to the question that I was about to ask, which has come up from an anonymous attendee, but an important question nonetheless, kind of asking whether or not there is a concern that if only one provider is willing to go into an area or stretch to certain places, is there a risk that competition, which is clearly proving so vital to driving up adoption and driving out support, is there a risk that competition starts to fade away in certain places and that there's not enough competition in the market in certain areas or for certain types of place? I might come to Esther, if that's all right, just on this question, and how we can ensure that there is competition even for those hard to reach places.
If only one company is going forward to do an area, it shows it probably isn't viable for any of the other businesses. So you can't impose competition because those businesses have already decided we cannot compete, we cannot do it, won't work. And that's where I think this analysis of those hardest to reach areas and how are we going to support them, and do they get extra financial support, because otherwise it isn't viable for a business to go in. It just isn't possible, which is, as I said, in the rural part of the country I represent, I have a lot of those premises, business and household. So I think you're going to say, no, there will need to be extra subsidy for those if we want it sooner rather than later. That's what I'd say. And then think about, are there other things we can do? Do we say those local businesses could maybe put some money in for that delivery, but then they get an exemption on business rates? Are the things that we can do within that sort of tax structure, the levers that governments have, is there something we can do to make it viable? But like I said, if only one business wants to do it, it kind of gives you the answer. It's you're not going to have competition, are you?
Thank you very much, Esther. I'm going to now take a question from Bronner McCloskey, who has asked how we can make sure that people can both access and afford better broadband connections to stop price becoming a barrier to good connections, further entrenching the digital divide. Sadly, the digital divide that we have seen play out considerably over the last year. Minister, I appreciate this is outside your brief, and so not asking you to speculate on your colleagues' priorities, but I'd be really interested in how you see this fitting into the government's priorities. We've heard the Prime Minister talk about Build Back Better. We know that the issue of the digital divide has been a really kind of big and prevalent problem over the last year or so, as kids have struggled to get access to school materials, as some families haven't had access to work or other economic opportunities through digital. How much do you see this as part of the government's core mission? Do they see this as part of levelling up, and how can we do more to address it, as Bronner asks? I'd be really interested in your perspective.
Well, I think it is, Will. I mean, you should probably level the question at Matt Warman or Gavin Williamson from the DCMS or DFE point of view. But I think from the outlook of number 10 Downing Street and his neighbour in number 11, then yes, digital connectivity and digitalisation is part of that core levelling up message. The fundamental way in which people will be able to take advantage wherever they happen to live or work of technology and do it cheaply is through competition, as Simon rightly pointed out. From our point of view in MHCLG, apart from the seed funding that has gone into the rural network, the £1 billion has gone into the rural network to get mobile phone operators to make sure that they spread connectivity much more effectively. We've looked at regulatory means, quite apart from planning reform, which is coming down the pipe, to see what we can do to encourage competition locally. So, for example, with Matt Warman, looking at how masts can be more effectively shared, which perhaps reduces the cost barriers of some providers to go into areas to provide a equivalent service which may be provided by one player more cheaply than another. So that's a way of regulatory levers that we can use to try to improve connectivity and also price. But yes, it is, I think, one of the key considerations of number 10, number 11 and other key ministries when it comes to levelling up.
Thank you, Chris. And I'm going to now come to Henry, because Henry, you mentioned a voucher scheme in your opening remarks that has been used to reduce some of the access problems that you alluded to. I'd be interested in hearing more about that, but also what lessons you think it has for national policy and the extent to which that could be rolled out much more consistently across the country in order to reduce the digital divide.
I think, the area we're focusing on, and I in terms of that particular scheme, that was the DWP with Talk, and that's now becoming national. It started off in the Northwest, but very much an export we're happy to share with the rest of the country, because that's part of the joy of place-based policy, right? Well, we're fans of it, which is you do something on a small scale, then you can do it with more people, and that's how you make change happen in public policy, rather than just trying to do things randomly without really trying to see if they work first. And I think what's been particularly interesting about that is clearly that was designed from the perspective of the job seeker, right? But actually then in Oldham, what they started doing was targeting that at families where some of the kind of efforts at digital connectivity and upgrades to mobile operators had not kind of cut through. Because what we've done sort of through the pandemic, and we've been involved with organisations like campaigns run by industry, the one in laptops for kids we're very closely associated with, that's raised significant amounts of money, right, to connect children temporarily to the internet, is that is only a stopgap, right? It's not going to deal with the longer term challenge, which is that in this day and age, the idea that there are families without access to this product because they can't afford it is a real barrier for social mobility in particular. And so I think for us, it's an economic issue, right? Of course, there's the question of fairness, but in some of these communities, it's a significant inhibitor on these children doing well. And that for us is a small investment compared to, say, the cost of education or the interventions we might make in schools. And we're often talking about in our wider work the issues beyond the school gates that affect attainment. That's why there's a big long-term disadvantage gap in the north of England. We don't think it's all down to digital connectivity, but it's definitely one of the factors in there. And I think it is one of those joined up public policy challenges, right, which is the minister rightly referred to the fact that actually there are other parts of government lead on all of this. Well, actually, it was a department you wouldn't expect, right, that have solved this problem. And I think that has been a challenge that the DFE have been very focused on the short-term policy question, but they've then got all these kids, right, with their computers who we sat in September, many of them potentially not being able to use them. And so what that I think creates, well, for people like us, right, is a good opportunity to think through long-term sustainable policy options, because no one wants the investment we made in the pandemic to then be frittered away. Does that make sense? Everyone wants to use this as a moment for that big political and economic reset that the country needed to have anyway. And productivity is a key challenge for us. Education and skills divides are a big factor in the productivity puzzle, probably more important than trains. Obviously, Esther and I disagree about HS2, but we agree about almost everything else, which is that whatever you think about some of those more complicated, expensive, controversial ways to raise productivity, doing more around education and skills in the north and other left behind places is absolutely part of the solution. And this is a key part of that question. Does that make sense? And that's the real point about the digital debate. It's no longer in terms of fibre and its importance just about the wires in the ground, because bluntly, Simon and his colleagues in the sector have sort of fixed the technical and the engineering problem. What we're now getting into is the place of use cases, adoption, and its impact on wider public services and public service reform, and particularly from the perspective of drawing together services together in local places, digitalisation and having better connection with many of these communities, many of whom these families would have been on Troubled Families programme. We've had lots of interventions thrown at them over the years. Well, actually, if we can see that connecting those families digitally makes it easier and cheaper to deliver public services and to support them into employment in particular, well, that absolutely hits the buttons around where this government needs to be going, because that's what we need, is to make interventions that have paybacks. And the Treasury is very happy to do that. Whether they're deployed locally or nationally, we think working with central and local government together, we can make a significant impact on some of these questions over the coming years. And that's why we're doing policy work on it, but it's absolutely rooted in the realities of the commercial world and what is deliverable practically and financially, rather than just saying, isn't this awful, we should do something about it. Actually, I think we're now at the point of saying, we all agree on the problem, let's find the cheapest, most practical, most sensible solutions, rather than just sort of almost being mystified by the complexity, because it's going to take a pan-government response, either at place level or centrally, to fix some of these challenges.
Henry, thank you so much. We've only got 5 minutes left, and I know that all of you have incredibly busy diaries, so I'm not going to keep you beyond 12:15, but I'm just going to go back, if I may, to Simon on this question, because I'm really interested in the industry response to the question of differential access and the digital divide. You're obviously rolling out your products to a variety of households who want it, but as you said right at the beginning, this fibre offers much better connectivity at a much reduced price. How can we ensure that those people who need that reduced price get it, as it were? Simon.
So I think I'm, forgive me, I'm going to spend a minute describing the structure of the industry in the UK. So there are basically two existing network builders, Openreach and Virgin. Virgin covers about 2/3 of the country, mostly urban or semi-urban. And up until 5 years ago, there was really no one else. And with the changes made by government in conjunction with the regulator, we now have this opportunity to build. And so the first input to creating that is creating competition, which it's never been here in the UK. And we know it works because we can see it in every other country in Europe and around the world, because the UK is an absolute laggard in terms of this. So that's the first thing. So creating that competition will actually drive that going forward. The second thing is we are a wholesale only player. That means we have retail ISPs, TalkTalk, Vodafone, Zen, which is a kind of real technology-oriented ISP sitting on our network. Okay, those actually have the end customers. They have the relationship with the end customers. There is actually plenty of good competition between those retail players today. Sorry, joys of connectivity. So we had those set up, and there is good competition there, but they've had no competition in the supply chain. Their only option has been to go to Openreach. So if your input costs are always the same, well, what happens? You don't have so much room to maneuver in pricing. By creating competition at the wholesale layer, by creating real infrastructure competition, you drive down prices. And that's when you're going to allow those retail players, who are all national players, by the way, they all have national pricing. That allows them to give them best flexibility. I know people are concerned that there'll be pockets where it's too expensive, but if you get the infrastructure competition right, you'll get the right retail competition as well. It'll lock together and you'll get the best prices in the market. And the UK, by the way, has had some of the lowest prices for broadband in Europe. So, the affordability really comes from the fact you get competition, but at every level in the value chain, that you don't just have one source for that key supply input from Openreach.
Simon, thank you very much. That's a brilliant way to end, because I think it is a kind of optimistic take on the direction of travel. We are moving to a more competitive marketplace, and not just at a retail level, but also at the infrastructure layer, as you say. And today's session has been brilliant, because we have genuinely got into some practical steps that we could take. I'm intrigued by the voucher scheme that Henry mentioned, and the leadership that DWP has taken on this. As you say, that's not the place that you would naturally go to in government for digital innovation or kind of action on closing the digital divide, but it's clear that that offers lots of promise. I personally really like the idea of a kind of time-limited flexibility around way leaves and permissions, and I think that there is very clear agreement on this panel that we should be treating high-speed fibre broadband as a utility in exactly the same way as we treat gas, electricity, water in that way. And it's also clear, just going back to the original purpose of this series and this panel, that this is essential to levelling up. As we move out of the pandemic, touch wood, in the coming months, we will see, I suspect, a very different economy to the one that entered the pandemic. Not entirely, but we will have more home working, more distributed economic activity, possibly greater levels of commuting 1 or 2 days a week rather than 5 days a week, etc. And that will present lots of opportunities for levelling up. And I think as the government starts to grapple with this, as they start to think about what the policy challenges are, we should be embracing the opportunity there rather than just seeing the challenges and the obstacles. So today has been a kind of positive and optimistic way to start the series, and I'm very grateful to all of you for your comments, for your thoughtful response to the questions, and for everyone who tuned in. So thank you very much for being with us. It is 12:15. You all have places to be in, or possibly the same place as you have been for the last year, but places to be and people to talk to via Zoom. So thank you all very much, and I look forward to engaging with you throughout the series as we take this forward. Thank you.
Well, very, very enjoyable.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks.